After beating back our spaceborne fleets, the first species the Empire sent against us were the Raggat, their most successful planetary invaders, and they did succeed in obliterating the trading posts on the atolls. But we had no trouble at all keeping them there, because they had precisely zero expertise with fighting in water. Aside from some minor luxuries, we are entirely self-sufficient in any case, so the loss of the atolls was not keenly felt. Then they sent in the Namart, who are an aquatic species, but who are usually kept away from the front lines because they're not the greatest strategists. Or fighters, for that matter. Predictably, we annihilated each force they sent within a day of detecting their contragrav signatures. About a year later, they stopped trying. Indeed, I had hoped the Empire would recognize the sovereignty of our home planet, at least, after that. As did I. But the third species they sent was another bunch of land dwellers, who came with wooden vessels to keep the air around them while they traveled the ocean's surface, somehow using the wind which flows so keenly overhead, I understand. We followed their contragrav signatures too, and drilled holes in their vessels from below, letting their air out. A masterful tactic, I do agree. The Qorsei fled in terror after only a few days. It was a splendid stroke of luck that they become heavier than water and almost immobilized when their fur is wet. And now they plan to send a fourth species to harass us. One that I am less than familiar with by name Ajman? What manner of creatures are they? Regretfully, I have only fragmentary information so far. They are comparatively recent additions to the Empire, and only as allies, not as an integral part. However, they are air-breathing land dwellers like most others, which is a good omen for us. They'll be restricted to the air and the surface. According to the latest imperial maps, their homeworld has both continents and oceans, but all of their major cities are land-based. The only worrying point is that they show remarkably advanced technology, but as we all know, seawater is a great disruptor of electric power and radio signals, so they'll still be at a disadvantage, at best, in the deep. But they do not have the crippling disabilities of the Qorsei, I see. There is no fur to speak of, and if these density figures are accurate, they would float unaided. So they will be slightly harder to kill after we let the air out of their vessels. That's why we have teeth and tentacles, is it not? They are no predator species. How they achieve spaceflight, I cannot fathom. Very well. Put the Guardians on alert for contragrav signatures, and concentrate them in the trade winds where the Qorsei preferred to set down. Maintain a watch on the atolls as well. We will prevail. It will be done, sire. Admiral Miller steepled his fingers and considered the delegation that had been sent to brief him. Along with the usual insectoid, reptilian and avian representatives from the Empire's high councils, whom he had already met, there were veteran soldiers from each of the three member species who had previously attempted to pacify the Tethians. All three, unlike the High Council members, were essentially mammalian. Not that Tethys was the official name of the planet in question, whether by its natives or the Empire, but it was one that the translators had been instructed to use in English, since every official alternative was downright unpronounceable. It was a water world, or as the scientists preferred, an Oceania, essentially what you would get if you cut the Pacific Ocean out of a map of Earth and called it a planet. It was an environment that no member species of the Empire had the foggiest idea how to fight in. Humans had, quite wisely in Miller's opinion, opted not to become full members of the Empire, but fostered close trading ties with them in the name of peaceful coexistence, backed up, of course, by humanity's easily demonstrated ability to defend itself against any form of invasion. It was, in fact, their early warning system and scout network which had provided the key to halting the Tethians' campaign of conquest. Earth, with its two-thirds ocean coverage, would have been a prime candidate for Tethian attention within a decade. That fact had definitely influenced the decision to share intelligence with the Empire, who in turn had conducted all the necessary combat operations within their own territory. Now, in return for certain trading advantages, the Empire was turning to humanity for rather more direct assistance. The go-ahead had been given by politicians well above his already lofty position in the chain of command. His lot was but to do or die, or at least to make the best of it. Know thy enemy. Hence today's briefing. But also, know thy friends. To human eyes, any alien stood out like a sore thumb. The three warriors across the table, though, were more striking than usual, though he was already somewhat familiar with the other species present. The most distracting, he decided, was the seal-like Namart, who kept dipping his head into the aerated wading pool his subordinates had managed to set up for its benefit. Such an obviously aquatic species would hopefully be the best source of intelligence on the Tethians. Privately, he suspected the Namart were not particularly well suited to combat. They had the sort of dolphin beak, lined with tiny teeth, that suggested they hunted only small prey, and not enough limbs to both swim effectively and wield a weapon at the same time. Against an aggressive apex predator, they would probably fare badly, and from what he'd heard so far, they had. Easily the most impressive, though, was the massive, ox-like Raggat, resplendent in what Miller hoped was only ceremonial armor. It looked completely impractical for actual combat. A pair of what he assumed were females, half the warrior's height and width, fussed deferentially over him. By reputation, the Raggat were indeed fearsome and effective soldiers by imperial standards, but had literally found themselves out of their depth on Tethys. That left the Qorsei, who looked like nothing more than a lion with an extra pair of limbs on its back, and had discreetly distanced itself as much as possible from the Namart and its wading pool. But, he remembered, it was only the Qorsei who had bothered to bring anything resembling a naval vessel to bear on this particular military problem, and for that he had to grant them a measure of respect. The problem was that an 18th-century British frigate would have taken one look at their ships and promptly capsized with laughter, when what was obviously required was some sort of submarine. That the Qorsei themselves were physically incapable of swimming had only added to their problems. Miller gestured to an aide, who dimmed the lights. Conversation, both translated and otherwise, petered out around the table, and he stood up to gain everyone's attention. "Shall we begin?" It was sheer luck, Blubter thought, that he'd picked up the trace of the new invaders. He had been stationed in one of the doldrum zones, well away from the expected ingress areas with plenty of wind, seemingly as a punishment for various minor disciplinary infractions committed by his crew during their last leave period. Nevertheless, a steady contragraph signature had been recorded, which he double-checked himself. There had been many short-lived false alarms over the past few days, to the point where he was starting to doubt the reliability of the equipment. There was no time to send word back, asking for reinforcements. He had to strike himself, and quickly, before these hegemons could possibly gain a foothold. Of course, he could report his victory and redeem himself and his crew for those minor infractions afterwards, all the more so for doing so single-handed. "Sire," called the echolocator urgently. "There is a floating object on the surface, 8 kilometers ahead. It is moving slowly to the north." "Follow it," he ordered promptly. "Ready the drill. We'll deal with them the same way as the Qorsei." It was as if their enemies never learned anything from their previous failures. More importantly, it confirmed that the contragrav detector was in fact working correctly. But easy victories were still victories, and worthy of praise. Praise which would be of great value come spawning season. The floating vessel did not react to their approach, even though its speed of full 30 kilometers per hour made the use of his own contragrav drive necessary to intercept it. The fools probably had their detectors pointed skyward, expecting an airborne attack, and of course only a true aquatic race had a hope of hearing the pulses they used for echolocation. Experiments had long ago proved that underwater noises were undetectable above the surface. "There!" He pointed at a convenient ridge near the rear end of the vessel, whose bottom seemed larger and smoother than those of the Qorsei. "Use the grapple to steady us, and drill our way through." "It will be done, sire!" chorused the breaching crew overhead. "Con sonar. Sierra 2, presumed hostile, has switched to medium-scale pinging, high frequency." "Acknowledged." "How's your tracking solution?" "Solid, sir. She's heading straight for the Trojan, 23 knots, 14,000 yards. We can put a fish in her any time we like." "Good to know." "Can they see us?" "Doubtful. She's the wrong side of the layer, we're bound to her, and their self-noise is appalling. Last time I heard a boat that noisy, it was one of those makeshift drug-running ones off Mexico." "Excellent. We get to sit back and watch the show." He frowned at his empty coffee mug, and waved it at one of the smaller figures in the control room. "If you please, Xena?" The female Raggat, serving as assistant steward on board HMS Neptune, obliged silently and gracefully. The Empire had insisted that competent observers be present on board the first human ships to engage the enemy. Of the available candidates, the male Raggat had been far too large. The Namart presented insuperable challenges to accommodate on board a human warship, and the Qorsei, though otherwise suitable, had been extremely reluctant to face this particular foe a second time. However, a young female Raggat and one particularly courageous Qorsei had volunteered. The Qorsei was on board HMS Trojan, presently on the plot as Sierra 1. Commander Ronalds had been pleasantly surprised to find that female Raggat were not merely subservient, but actually rather intelligent. His extra crewmen had picked up the essentials of her duty within a day, long before they actually landed in hostile territory, and certainly knew better than to fiddle with equipment she didn't understand, which for the time being, was most of it outside the galley. The one wrinkle was that Raggat insisted on sexual reinforcement of the bond between a master and his females, and Ronalds was, indisputably, the master aboard his ship, but the less said about that the better. "Number 1, maintain station on the Trojan. Terry's a good man, he'll hold course." "Aye, sir." Good peered critically at the sonar plot, and made the necessary small corrections. "Make turns for 16 knots, come right to course 006. 006, helm aye. Engine room acknowledges 16 knots. Good also held commander rank, but with less seniority than Ronalds. He was due for his own ship, just as soon as he could be bothered to ask for one. For this mission, he had considered it prudent to stay on Ronald's crew, rather than have them dive into an unfamiliar xenocombat situation with a fresh substitute. The experience would undoubtedly be valuable, too, if this campaign went on anywhere near as long as a planet-wide war was likely to. "There's another reason they can't see us," remarked Ronalds grimly. "We've switched off our contragrav. Trojans left it on, so they're naturally focusing on her. Contragrav detectors, we had them, sure, but it was quite a surprise to find out anyone else did." "At this sort of range," replied Good, "they'll only get a very approximate bearing. Practically have to go out to the moon to get any real accuracy. Still better that they don't know we're here at all. Of course. Now if they think we're just another Qorsei, they'll try to drill through the Trojan's hull, but that's hardened steel, not pine wood, so they'll find it a heck of a lot more difficult. What I'm interested in is what they'll do when they figure that out. Grapple secure. Start drilling. Watch out for that spinning mechanism. See how it churns the water with its blades?" 4 teams of drillers hove their augers upwards, thrusting their points against the bottom of the enemy vessel, and began to turn the handles furiously. But the expected resistance to turning never materialized, and when they looked back up at the drills, they saw that they had only scraped a thin layer of paint off. "The drills aren't biting. Push harder!" Extra Tethians squeezed themselves in around the drill harness, bracing themselves against the upper frames of their own craft, but the result was the same. "It's no good, sire. This vessel is made of metal, not wood. The drills cannot pierce it. Then we'll just have to kill them one by one. Boarding parties." "Sire! They still have air in their vessel, not water. You've got lungs, haven't you? It'll do you some good to use them for a change." "Yes, sire. It will be done. Loose the grapple. Ready the assault ropes. We'll surge forward and come to the surface in their path." The fighters drew their blades and let out a cheer. There would be some action for them at last. "Enemy submarines surfacing directly ahead, sir." "Very good. All hands remain concealed. Maintain steady course and speed. Let's see just what they plan to do with us." HMS Trojan was aptly named. On the surface, she looked very much like a small warship from just after the Second World War, with steam turbine engines, 3 twin turrets, a set of torpedo tubes, depth charge racks and launchers, a small array of missile tubes, radar masts everywhere, and 2 slender funnels. Her bridge was only partly enclosed, and was surmounted by a visual targeting station complete with optical rangefinder. Such equipment was hopelessly obsolete for fighting any of Earth's major navies, but represented an absolute treasure trove of advanced technology for any other known species in the galaxy. Except that there was no ammunition for these weapons anywhere on board. Not a single actual torpedo, nor missile, nor shell, nor even a stray bullet outside of the crew's personal weapons. The fuel tanks had been drawn deliberately low, so that she wouldn't be able to sail far without being topped up, and the contragrav drive was so housed that it could only be operated from the strong rooms, which were where all of her crew were stationed. Remote controls permitted full control of her course and speed, cameras allowed the lookouts to maintain their watch, and Marines had been stationed in secure locations throughout the ship, awaiting their cue. In truth, HMS Trojan was a spaceship, around which the hull, machinery, and superstructure of a naval destroyer had been bolted on. So, when the Tethians stormed on board, they found not a single soul anywhere to resist them. "It is fortunate," rumbled Pervet, "that they did not succeed with their drilling. I have no wish to join so many of my brothers at the bottom of this alien sea." "Even if they had made a hole," replied Terry, "it'd take more than a few little holes to sink a ship of the Royal Navy. We are the last word in damage control expertise, and that's ignoring the fact that these strong rooms are an airtight spaceship in their own right. We could have risen straight into the air on the contragrav, without giving it a second thought." "That may be so, but I have difficulty understanding why you allowed them to board so easily. Isn't it easier to repel enemies before they enter your own base?" "That depends whether you've booby-trapped your base in anticipation of such a scenario. Our mission, my friend, is reconnaissance. The Trojan and the Neptune, capable though they are, will never take any enemy cities by themselves, nor can they convince a determined defender to surrender their homeworld, yet the fleet waiting behind us will depend on the information we discover today. So have patience, watch, and learn." "Reconnaissance? What can you learn about a submarine species from the surface of their own ocean?" "That's what we're here to find out. And already we have learned something. That they can breathe air as well as water, and that they are equipped to fight on solid ground. They are agile and dexterous enough out of water to mount a boarding action. Can you imagine a Namart doing that? And they have left a crew on board their own ship, which he tapped the sonar display meaningfully, is now disengaging and heading off somewhere else. All of these things are useful to know during future engagements, and meanwhile we are in little danger ourselves." "Sir? They've reached the bridge. Shall I transfer control?" Terry turned to the lookout who had interrupted their conversation, and examined the little video screens which covered the bridge from all angles. The creatures now crawling around it looked disturbingly like the unholy union of a shark with a giant squid, proving the accuracy of the sketches provided by the Namart. "Wait until they actually try turning the wheel. Make sure they get to understand what it's for." "Aye, sir." "And this way," said Terry quickly, forestalling the Qorsei's next question. "We might just find out where one of their cities is. Once we know that much, and how it's laid out, we can think about what to do about it." "Con sonar. Possible aspect change on Sierra 1. Is she changing course?" "Stand by. How's the track on Sierra 2? "Still solid as a rock, making good speed to the east-northeast. I think we can overhaul her if we try." "Very good. And Sierra 1? "She's coming right, sir. I don't have an exact course yet, but her turn rate's still the same. Make that plot a priority." Terry wouldn't have changed course by himself, so I think we can safely say the gift has been accepted. There were knowing nods and smiles all around, all except for Xena, who only looked puzzled. "Forgive me for asking," she said softly, both her natural and translated voices being pleasantly feminine. "Why do you give our enemies a gift? And why is this seemingly a good thing?" "We have an old story," explained Ronalds, "of a siege which took place thousands of years ago, of a city called Troy. The besiegers eventually built a giant wooden horse, an elegant beast of burden, if you're unfamiliar with it, and left it outside the city gates, then abandoned their siege engines and left the battlefield deserted. The people of Troy took the horse into the city, believing it to be a gift and that they had outlasted the siege. But that night, some soldiers that had been hiding inside the horse came out, opened the city gates, and let their comrades in. Because of that story, we attach special meaning to the phrase Trojan horse. Trojan, that is the name of the other ship? Correct. And there are soldiers hiding inside it. So I see now. The enemy is steering the ship, but you can win it back? At any moment we choose. Xena nodded and fell silent once more. Sierra 1's course probably follows Sierra 2, said the sonarman after a moment. East-northeast. Very good. Come right to course 070, ahead full. 070, helm aye. Engine room acknowledges ahead full. Let's have a few more minutes to firm up the Trojan's course, then we'll chase down Sierra 2 and give her something to think about. The less they know about what we're doing, the better. Oh, and Xena? Some more coffee, please. Launch transient. Bearing of Sierra 1, the Neptune. The Trojan CIC instantly became a nexus of tension, even though they knew that the ship which had just launched a torpedo was on their side. It was, in fact, the very first shot fired in the human-Tethian war. New contact Sierra 3. Acoustic signature matches torpedo, spearfish. Tracking left, towards Sierra 2, and fading. There was an almost audible sigh of relief throughout the room. Tracking left meant it wasn't headed directly towards them, at least. Neptune had pulled far enough ahead of them that friendly fire, even from a seriously malfunctioning torpedo, was exceedingly unlikely, and spearfish torpedoes were among the most reliable ever made. The fact remained, however, that this was the first time a torpedo had been fired into an alien ocean, one with a different level of gravity than on Earth. It would be a tense few minutes as the autonomous weapon closed the distance to its target, switched on its active sonar, and began to hunt. Sierra 3 has gone active, short scale. The Tethians would now realize that they were not alone down there, but it was far too late for them to do anything about it. Sierra 3 is terminal homing. Every man on board had watched Das Boot. They knew how terrifying it could be to hear the sonar pings coming closer, and more rapidly, with death loaded immediately behind them. Loud explosion bearing of Sierra 2. Well, said Terry to nobody in particular. If we weren't at war already, we definitely are now. Any reaction from our guests? The internal lookouts looked up from their screens and glanced at each other. No, sir, no reaction. I don't think they heard it. Sierra 2 is breaking up, sir. Very good. Make a note of that, number 1, with the time. And I think that's our cue to unwrap the gift. Which means what, precisely? Asked Pervet. It means we take a whole lot of Tethians prisoner, and take them away for interrogation. How many of them are not in an enclosed space? 2 on the bridge, sir. 3 on the fantail. 1 riding on top of Alpha turret. Is that all? Yes, sir. 6 in total. Marine divisions report ready, sir. Very good. Pervet, put your gas mask on. You're going out with them. Make yourself useful. Take them alive if you can, kill if you must. Aye, sir. Helm, retake control of steering and hold present course. Aye, sir. Steady on 068, making turns for 15 knots. Put them to sleep, Bones. Activating gas discharge now, sir. Let's hope this works. It did. Congratulations, Commander, said Admiral Miller genially. It's not often that an operation goes this smoothly. All objectives achieved, no casualties, and you brought your ship back in one piece. If I'm not entirely mistaken, sir, one of the objectives was to locate an enemy city or major industrial plant. We have what might be a line of bearing to one, which the Neptune is following up on as we speak. I don't expect we'll hear from her for a while. That's what submarines do, after all, but you and your ship did everything by the numbers. That's an achievement we can all be proud of, and intelligence is practically salivating at the chance of interrogating all those prisoners you brought back. Speaking of casualties, we did lose a few potential prisoners. Which wasn't your fault. Adverse reactions to knockout drugs aren't something you can predict too accurately on a species we hadn't studied before. We'll aim to do better next time. Yes, sir. And Ensign Pervet? In my opinion, he acquitted himself very well. I intend to return him to Imperial space with a letter of commendation. I do have one question, though. Oh? How many times did you have to discipline your men for sniggering about his name? None, sir. None? Really? They're sailors, sir. Sniggering at dirty jokes is what they do. I'd have stepped in if they took it too far, sir. I'm sure. Well, then shall we see what the galley's serving tonight? After you, sir.